So I'd love to talk a little bit more about your business. So what do you do for your clients? What do you do?
Yeah, so I mean, I will do the editing, the engineering. It's
What's the
all the
difference?
technical stuff. Ah, yes. So this is a tricky. I think this may be more subjective than I would be ready to admit, but editing in my mind, and I think in general, is really just kind of like cutting out stuff and just making the content sort of content wise correct, right? So like if you're cutting you're cutting like spaces, you're cutting segments that don't need to be there, you're adding any segments that were recorded after the fact, or maybe adding like an intro and outro and all that stuff. Engineering is really where you get into like, okay, now you need to think about, I'm going to go kind of like full nerd here, but like now you need to think about starting to add EQs to your vocal tracks to make sure everything sounds like appropriate and that there's not too much like muddy kind of frequencies making someone sound like they're coming through like a box. You need to think about compression. You need to start making sure the dynamics are nice and kind of like even, so that if someone's listening in a kind of noisy environment, it's not like some words pop out and others get drowned out. You need to start thinking about noise reduction. You need to start thinking about like getting rid of specific moments, or like if someone's too close to their mic and they're like popping it a lot, you need to get rid of those. So engineering in my mind is really the technical stuff that goes into like fixing the audio. Editing is a little bit more about like arranging the audio, if that kind of makes sense.
So this is when, if you're editing, you look for the effects.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, like in Audacity, I think they're called like effects, and they've got a few, obviously. But yeah, there's a whole. I mean, to draw the music analogy out further, in uh, basically a recording studio, there's one guy, sometimes multiple guys, depending on how big the studio is, who his entire job is to do the editing, and then he hands it off to another guy who his entire job is to do the engineering. so, so you know, like it's just a different kind of a different goal in mind. One of them is like kind of the polish, making it really sound good, and the other one is making it sort of like arrange well and kind of fit well content wise.
And who does the music?
Who does the music? It like for in what
Well,
situation?
I mean, in that situation you're describing, there's like an
Yeah,
editor,
yeah,
then there's
yeah.
the
Oh, I
technical
mean,
person, and then there's the music person, and
oh
then what
yeah,
happens?
yeah. Well, so that's the thing. Like, yeah, if you want to really dive into the recording studio, there's the talent, like there's the artist, right? And they go in, they record, and and again, like in the biggest of kind of most well-known studios, there's a guy who his entire purpose is to set up the mics and then basically record stuff. He hands it off to another guy who basically puts all the tracks into place and chooses what they're going to use, what they're not going to use, and edits them down. Then there's another guy does all the engineering. It's usually called like all the mixing. And then sometimes there's another guy who will do what's called mastering, which is like the last kind of 10% of making it really sound like basically radio ready. So, you know, there's there's really no reason to go through that many steps for podcasting, but I think there is a really good reason for striving to engineer your podcast properly to make sure it does sound like quality wise and kind of like um, you know, make sure it's got that extra sheen and make sure like everyone's kind of like sounding like they're in a studio and not like they're in a room somewhere in like a bedroom or in a coffee shop or whatever.
Yeah. I think that it's helpful if people are ever hard on themselves or like, why doesn't my podcast sound like this other podcast? Especially if you're DIYing it. It's because
Mhm.
you're one person
Yeah,
and there's sometimes 3 to 4 people working on some of these like bigger podcasts that have this broadcast quality podcast. So just
absolutely.
to put it into perspective, and you don't need to have that high quality. I don't want to really, I don't know if even that's the word to say it. This to
Yeah,
connect with an audience, to grow your podcast, to engage with people, to monetize your podcast if that's what you want to do at some point, but to like make an impact in somebody's life, to
yeah,
actually like connect with them and like touch their heart and make them feel good about the day.
yeah.
Um, you don't need all of those bells and whistles to actually make an impact.
For
It's more about what you're saying and how you're getting it to people.